Hello, in this video I will go over the remaining three dimensions of Hofstede, namely uncertainty avoidance, the masculinity femininity dimension, and the long-term versus short-term orientation dimension. I will not dive as deep into these three dimensions as I did for power distance and individualism collectivism, but I think I will still provide enough details so that you gain some good understanding about these dimensions. I also plan to provide you some parallels with certain personality traits, because I think many of these cultural dimensions, the authors who came up with these dimensions, they did take inspiration from personality traits. So what personality traits are to an individual, culture is to, or these cultural dimensions are for nations or for large groups of people. That's the kind of parallel that you can draw. So when I'm discussing these different dimensions, I will also speak about how they connect with some of the big five personality traits, for instance. In any case, now I will shift to the iPad so that you can see my screen. Okay, so we will start our discussion with the dimension of uncertainty avoidance. So if we just go by the definition, uncertainty avoidance is the extent to which members of a culture, of a nation, feel threatened by ambiguous and unknown situations. So what does this mean in simple language? Basically, what we are saying here is that cultures vary based on how comfortable or uncomfortable they are with respect to handling ambiguity, with respect to handling uncertainty. So some cultures, people feel threatened when there isn't clarity about everything. When we then talk about cultures on the opposite spectrum, so we have acceptance of uncertainty on one dimension, on one end, and the other we have avoidance. Okay, avoidance of uncertainty. So I just talked about what we see in cultures where there is avoidance for uncertainty, but we also see cultures where people are very comfortable with any uncertainty. They do not easily get stressed when there is some ambiguity or there are certain unknowns. They are okay with it. Consequently, they are not working hard to avoid any uncertainty because they are comfortable being in uncertain situations. They are not trying to avoid uncertain situations. So that's of course what we mean by uncertainty avoidance in simple words. Often though, uncertainty avoidance gets confused with risk-taking behavior. Now, yes, if somebody is avoiding any uncertainty, wants everything well defined, that is associated with risk avoidance or risk-taking behaviors, right? But understand that risk-taking behavior or risk avoidance behavior can come from Hofstede's other dimensions as well. For the two dimensions that I have already spoken about, for instance, power distance and individualism, collectivism. In high power distance cultures, where you would remember I discussed about there being hierarchical structures, where there is a deeply ingrained value that you have to respect people above you. There is that strong emphasis on authority, on respecting authority and obeying those in positions of power. So in those cultures also you will see risk avoidance, because questioning authority or taking any form of unconventional action could be considered what? Disrespectful to people in power. On the other hand, if you were in the low power distance culture where things are more equal, or there is less emphasis on those differences in power and authority, an individual may feel empowered to take risks. So again, primarily because of that, there will be less fear among people that there will be any form of backlash, and consequently people will be happy to take risks. Even individualism, collectivism, which we talked about in the last video, we do see greater amounts of risk taking in individualistic cultures than in collectivistic cultures. And I did discuss that in great detail. Why? In individualistic cultures, focus is on personal goals, on achievements, and you are not burdened with many responsibilities of taking care of multiple people that you may be in collectivistic cultures. Consequently, it becomes easier for you to take risks, right? When you are traveling alone, for instance, you would be okay taking certain risks, going into certain relatively unsafe areas. But if you are traveling with your family, with your wife and little girl, you would not be as inclined to taking risks because you are responsible for people. So similar kind of analogy. In collectivistic societies, people feel responsible for a large number of people. Consequently, you would see less risks. I digressed a little bit, of course, but what I want to emphasize is that uncertainty avoidance is not just about avoidance or taking of any risks. Uncertainty avoidance primarily focuses on how comfortable or uncomfortable you are with ambiguous situations. You are with uncertainty. And yes, depending on how comfortable or uncomfortable you are, it will have implications on your risk-taking behavior. But so do some of the other dimensions of Hofstede. Even they influence your risk-taking behavior. In any case, now let's dive a little deeper into uncertainty avoidance. So think of a student. You all are students. Now, some of you prefer detailed syllabus. For any assignments, you want detailed rubrics where the professor should provide the exact number of points that you can gain under each parameter. You may prefer that there be clear-cut policies about everything that is supposed to happen in the class. You may want complete clarity about when what is expected and what would be the consequences if there is a delay of your submission by a few minutes or few hours or a day, right? But then you will also see students who don't get worried about these things. They are fine. There being not clear emphasis about everything in the class. They may be fine with respect to even not having a rubric on some particular assignment. Forget about having a rubric that is not as specific. So these individual differences that you see, that is, of course, often because of differences in personality traits. For instance, you would remember in the big 5 personality traits, there is the trait of neuroticism, where people who are high on the neuroticism dimension, they have a greater tendency to experience negative emotions, such as anxiety, fear, worry. Whereas those who are low on the neuroticism dimension, who they are called people who have high emotional stability, they are not as anxious or sensitive to uncertainty. So they do not go to great lengths to avoid any uncertainty. And there is the other dimension also, conscientiousness. And if you have attended my classes, if you have watched my videos, you know how much of emphasis I give on the personality trait of conscientiousness. It is one of the strongest predictors of success and even happiness in life. But sometimes too much of conscientiousness can actually be associated with risk averse kind of behaviors. Why? Because a person who is highly conscientious will be, as a matter of habit, as a matter of tendency, be very organized, be very detail oriented. So that person will do strong planning for everything. Now, suddenly, if that person is in a situation where he hasn't planned things in great detail, where he hasn't had the opportunity to prepare for all the eventualities which he normally does, then you can imagine this person will be uncomfortable. This person will be anxious and worried. So, again, the point is people avoid uncertainty also because of personality traits, not just because of cultural differences. And again, this is something that I have been emphasizing over and over again. In fact, many of the dimensions of culture, they were inspired by the differences in personality traits that had been studied for a long period of time. So the cultural dimensions could be considered more as analogous parallels for what you see between individual differences based on their personality traits. So the example that I just gave about some students preferring everything being detailed and specified and some others being not too worried about it, those differences in tendencies could be then happening because of personality trait differences, but also it could be happening because of people being from different cultures. So that's something that you need to then keep in mind. So anyone who is avoiding uncertainty because of not being comfortable with uncertainty, you then see uncertainty as a threat, and that's how you experience greater amounts of stress, greater amounts of anxiety. Whereas in uncertainty accepting cultures, you are not as worried. You accept uncertainty as part of your life. It's just part of your life. So in uncertainty avoidance societies, you will see more rules because you don't like uncertainty. You then specify everything with rules. Sometimes there may be so many rules that it literally becomes impractical. It becomes difficult for you to function. Whereas in uncertainty acceptance societies, you will not see as many rules. It's rarely the case that there are no rules, but you will see fewer rules. And even wherever there are rules, there is some amount of flexibility. Now, I talked about innovation, I talked about creativity before. Now, which culture do you think you will see greater amounts of creativity, greater amounts of innovation? Will you see that more in uncertainty avoidance cultures or uncertainty acceptance cultures? Well, if you said uncertainty acceptance cultures, that's of course correct. Why? Because anytime you are engaging in any creative pursuit, you are pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. You are not playing by the strict rules of the game. So whatever rules of the game are, you are not playing by those rules. You are not playing by those rules, or you are pushing those rules as much as you can. And that's where then you come up with creative output. Because of that reason, you will see greater amounts of creativity, greater amounts of innovation happening in uncertainty acceptance cultures. And by the way, you don't have to think about these differences only when it comes to countries. You will see such cultural differences, let's say, between different genres of musicians. That comes to mind, especially when I'm talking about pushing the rules of the boundaries. So I would say jazz, for instance, jazz musicians, they will be more about uncertainty acceptance culture, whereas the traditional in the Western tradition, the classical musicians, so not so much in the Indian tradition. In the Indian tradition, the classical musicians are also like jazz artists. They engage in a lot of innovation, spontaneous innovations. But in the Western context, for which you are more familiar with, the jazz musicians will be more those musicians who are comfortable with uncertainty. They are comfortable with their players going in different directions for which they hadn't rehearsed, for which they hadn't prepared. Whereas in the traditional Western classical music, everything is codified and you have to follow that same sequence at same timing, everything. And as you can see here, it is not a case that jazz is better or that Western classical music is better. They all have their own beauty. So the point then is but over a period of time tend to see different forms of behaviors in these different societies, in these different cultures. So why are some cultures more uncertainty avoiding and why are some cultures more accepting? Frankly, that is a question that I don't have clear answers for. At an individual level, I know there are those personality level differences, and we see these personality level differences because each has its own set of advantages. Each of these approaches has its own set of advantages. But at the cultural level, I'm not sure why we have certain cultures that have grown into being highly uncertainty avoidant and other cultures that have grown into being highly uncertainty accepting. I can understand the philosophies that some of these nations have, that their own ancient philosophy, I'm sure, would have contributed to that. For instance, in the Indian tradition, something that emphasizes multiple realities, multiple gods, people then become very comfortable with there being differences between each other based on thoughts, based on values, based on what they believe in. But imagine if you were born in a country that has heavy emphasis on you believing in only one particular god, whatever name you give that gods, or it could be a nameless god too. But if you only believe in this god, it is acceptable. If you do not, then you are in trouble. Then you are considered infidel, or you may even lose your life. So if that is the kind of philosophy that has been dominant, for instance, you would of course see more of uncertainty avoidance. People would be more focused on having clarity about everything. They don't want any ambiguity. Yeah. But then I don't know if this is a chicken and egg kind of situation. But in today's context, with respect to modern technology, again, you will see greater embracement of technology by some people and not so much by other groups of people. So here in the US, for instance, we see the Amish population. They have strict regulations about what all technology they can use and what all technology they are not supposed to use. And by the way, that way of living has its own sets of advantages and it has its own set of disadvantages. But these are some examples to illustrate the differences between uncertainty avoidance cultures and uncertainty acceptance cultures. We will now move to the next dimension, which would be masculinity, femininity. So the next dimension that we will talk about is masculinity and femininity. And like the other dimensions that we have discussed so far, they are on the opposite ends of the same continuum. They are not independent categories, but opposite ends of the same continuum. On one hand, we have cultures that are highly masculine, meaning more man-like, and on the other end, we have cultures that are more women-like. But what does that mean, man-like, women-like? Aren't we being sexist by saying that men and women are different? Well, there are lots of similarities between men and women, but men and women do differ on certain dimensions as well, both at a physical level as well as at the psychological level. For instance, if I was measuring the height of people in the population, and the more to the right, the taller they are, more to the left, the shorter they are. Okay. Now, the graph for men may look something like this. The graph for women in the population may look something like this. Okay. So, what you see here on an average, males, so the blue line refers to males here for simplicity's sake. On average, the males tend to be taller. Male average is taller than the female average. But does that mean all men are taller? No. There are several men here that you see. They are even shorter than the average female. Right? And similarly, there are many women here that are taller than a substantial portion of the males. But on a general level, on an average level, we see males to be taller than females. And this is, of course, something that we would all agree upon without much controversy. But we see similar distinctions in other areas of life as well. For instance, we see males tend to be less agreeable. Males tend to be less agreeable than females. So if our graph was going this way for agreeableness, on the more to the left is you are more agreeable and more to the right would be less agreeable, then we tend to see the male average being lower than the female average. And for those who do not remember what agreeableness is one of those big 5 personality traits that shows your tendency to be nurturing, to be empathetic, to be compassionate. These are people who are high on the agreeableness dimension. But if you are lower on the agreeableness dimension, which would be the case for the males, again, overall at an average level, these people in the worst case scenario will be jerks. But if we are not talking about the worst case scenarios, they would be people who would be extremely competitive. They would be people who would be focused more on achievement, being competitive. And this is exactly what the masculine, feminine dimensions of the culture also talk about. The masculine cultures tend to be, what I would say, extremely assertive, tough, I would say, focused on being, success, competition, being competitive, win at all costs. Those kinds of traits tend to predominate the masculine cultures, whereas in the feminine cultures, we tend to see more emphasis on being sympathetic, being caring, being cooperative, being nurturing. That's the feminine culture. So these are the key differences that we see. By the way, there is one more major distinction between the masculine and the feminine cultures, and that needs to be emphasized as well. In the masculine cultures, what we see is we see a major distinction between the roles of males and roles of females. So the males tend to be extremely masculine, all these characteristics that we talked about, and females would be also extremely feminine in terms of being caring, nurturing, compassionate. So we see a major difference in their approaches, in their roles. So males would be highly focused on the work, females may be focused on exclusively on nurturing their family. So these kinds of major distinctions we tend to see in cultures that are highly masculine. Whereas in feminine cultures, we see those differences between males and females essentially getting blurred. So they tend to blur into each other. There isn't as much of a distinction between these roles that you see between males and females. And after the blurring, they tend to be more in the feminine direction. That is another key point to be highlighted in the feminine culture. So not only do these distinctions get blurred, they tend to be more in the direction of the feminine culture. That is that of being sympathetic, being nurturing, being caring. That's the key difference that you see between the masculine and feminine cultures. And as I have always emphasized, these differences you tend to see not just between companies, not just between countries, but also between companies, also between departments within a company. At my university, for instance, you will see the masculine culture being stronger, let's say in some of the engineering departments, construction engineering or electrical engineering, whereas you will see more of a feminine culture in education or psychology, where the focus is on caring for certain groups of people. So I made several points here. First of all, there is a real life distinction in the qualities of males and females. It's not that all males and females are equal on every dimension, and it's not that they do not have their own distinct strengths and weaknesses. So these distinctions are well studied, established facts in biology, in psychology, literature. And what we see here in masculine and feminine cultures is that we see some of these differences also getting displayed at the cultural level. So in the masculine cultures, we will see especially the men, the boys, being extremely assertive, tough. They prioritize success at all cost. And females tend to focus, or the girls tend to focus on the family and taking care of family, those kind of roles. Whereas in the feminine cultures, these distinctions get blurred and they tend to be more in the direction of empathy, nurturing. So one of the ways that I visualize masculine culture is like a rugged mountain, where you have to be tough to survive in those harsh, brutal conditions. Whereas feminine cultures, I often visualize it as in form of a garden, that is well supported with fertile ground, with adequate water supply, with adequate sunshine. So there is plenty available. There is no need for somebody to be tough and brutal. So these are some of the imagery kind of distinctions that I hope makes some difference or makes some understanding for you. Or another way of thinking about it is, maybe you can think of masculine cultures they are like the archetype of a warrior, whereas the feminine culture is the archetype of a healer, right? Or that of a mother. So these are some of the distinctions that we see in these different cultures. And I mentioned about agreeableness earlier, and actually agreeableness, the reason I discussed it is I think that is one of those big five personality traits that matches up perfectly with the masculinity femininity trait, because agreeableness as a dimension refers to how nurturing, how empathetic, how tuned you are to cooperation, or tuned you are to conflict. So if you are highly agreeable, you are more nurturing, compassionate, whereas if you are less agreeable, you are more tuned towards being competitive, towards enjoying conflict as opposed to avoiding conflict. So we tend to see these same distinctions also at the societal level. Now, in terms of why we see these differences, I think it could be related to historical reasons why certain cultures tend to become more masculine and why certain other cultures become more feminine. If historically, as a country, you have had experienced lots of wars where men had to go and sacrifice their lives to protect their families, then naturally over a period of time, and if those wars have, or those attacks from outsiders have continued for a long enough period of time, then it can become part of the psyche. And you will then see those distinctions in the roles that people take up in these different cultures. Whereas in a land of plenty, where there isn't as much of a danger in a traditional, maybe agrarian kind of society, people will be fine nurturing and caring for each other. You may not even see as much of distinction between what males and females do. There will be some distinction, of course, but not to the extent that you will see in the traditionally masculine cultures. The important thing to remember here is that all these things have implications for leadership. Certain styles of leadership will work better in certain cultures, and which style will work also depend on whether you are a male or female. For instance, if you are a female working in a masculine culture, it may be extremely challenging if you are especially following an assertive kind of style in your leading. People in this culture may not be accepting of that style. Whereas the opposite, like a male person, again, probably who is extremely assertive, he may still be able to adjust in the feminine culture. But a female may experience a lot of difficulties in a masculine culture, especially if that person is assertive and highly competitive. But the female may be embraced into the culture if she is more nurturing in her approach to leading. By the way, my point is not that I'm recommending you to be nurturing, but my point is that you will get easier acceptance if you are engaging in more individualized consideration kind of behaviors as opposed to more transactional, more authoritative behaviors as a female. So these are some of the impacts that you would see of different cultures on people's behavior, and how as leaders then you need to modify your approach to leading, or even as a team member, to while you are interacting with people from these different types of cultures. The last dimension that we will be talking about is the long-term versus short-term orientation. Long-term versus short-term. Well, we will be talking about one more dimension too, but we will talk about both these two dimensions, long-term, short-term orientation, and the last one, indulgence, pretty briefly. These dimensions were proposed by Hofstede much later. They were not in his initial model. Nonetheless, they do provide some great insights about how people from different cultures approach. At least that's the focus in the long-term versus short-term orientation. More specifically, what Hofstede says, cultures that have long-term orientation tend to be, of course, future-oriented, So they are thinking really long into the future, how their actions will impact life really long into the future. And they tend to be very pragmatic as well. They tend to be very practical. They naturally then, because they are thinking really long term into the future, they tend to work hard, they tend to persevere. So you will see high amounts of perseverance there. They tend to save money, so they tend to be, you will see higher amounts of they being thrifty. And another important characteristic you would see in them is that they tend to be very adaptable, more adjustable than people who have a short term focus. Short term focus, they are more focused on the immediate. So, what happened? Okay. So, they tend to focus more on their present and also like pride. So, short term orientation, the focus is more on the immediate as opposed to the long term focus that you will see in the long term oriented cultures, of course. But in short term orientation, at least as per Hofstede's model, they also focus a lot on the past and aren't as concerned about the long term outcomes. They are not concerned. So they are not concerned for the long term outcomes. And as you can see or imagine, they both may have some advantages. By the way, like I always bring in some of the personality traits, parallels here, which personality trait do you think will be most strongly associated with this kind of mindset where you have the distinction between long term and short term orientation? If you said conscientious, I would say that's correct, right? Because conscientious people, those who are high on conscientiousness, they tend to work hard. They tend to work hard not just for immediate kind of gratification. Immediate gratification is something that you see in short term orientation, immediate gratification. So you may take a project that is likely to succeed in the short run, but you are not thinking so much about the long term, whether it is in consonance, whether it is in alignment with your long term goals. That is more short term orientation. So that would be something that you would see in people who are low on conscientiousness. So being thrifty, being hardworking, being future oriented, these are typically characteristics that you associate with people who are highly conscientious. And those who are low on conscientiousness, they tend to focus more on the immediate gratification. And you must be aware of all the interesting studies that have been done on immediate gratification and delaying gratification, right? Where you may be aware of the marshmallow experiment, where little kids are brought into a lab and they are offered a marshmallow which they are allowed to eat immediately if they want to, but if they wait for the period that the experimenter leaves the office, then the condition is that they will get 2 marshmallows. So that's an example of these kids either having a long-term orientation or short-term orientation. But of course, in the little kids' case, the long-term and short-term orientation is being determined based on how they respond to this situation that lasts for a few minutes. But in case of countries, in case of cultures, or for that matter, if we are talking about people who are adults or companies, we are talking about years or maybe even decades, maybe even centuries when we are talking about long-term orientation. Whereas short-term orientation would be focus being on just the immediate quarter results, or maybe even the monthly results, or maybe even daily results. Those are the kind of difference in focus that you will see in the cultures that have long term and short term versus short term cultures. So you can imagine then that depending on which orientation people in a particular culture have, they will engage in different forms of decision making. They will engage in different communication strategies. They may give different emphasis to their relationships. So, even in the work context, like Japan, for instance, that has traditionally been one of the strongest long term oriented cultures, things are changing now, but for a long period, they had lifelong employment, even though the rest of the world had changed that approach. So, you would see loyalty more in the long term orientation when it comes to relationships. Or at least if you are a person who is making decisions pertaining to that, you may have to take those things into consideration, not just quick hire and fire kind of approach that you may see in the short term oriented culture. So naturally, there are ethical considerations that come into play as well, depending on which culture you are working in. Certain things may be considered acceptable, certain things may be considered unacceptable. But generally, I may not say this for many of the other dimensions, but at least for the long term, short term orientation, I definitely have a strong preference for the long term orientation. By the way, long term orientation does not prevent you from considering the short term implications of your decisions, of your actions. In fact, it does emphasize clearly that long term orientation includes pragmatism, which means you are practical. You are being practical. Because if you only think about long term and never think about the short term implications of your act, then that can be a highly problematic strategy. As they say, in the long term, we are all dead if you are not taking care of the short term, especially. So, in cases of organizations, they have to be profitable in the short term as well. If you are only making losses in the short term over and over again, then there can be no likelihood that the company will make big profits in the long term. So it's a balance. And you can imagine why I have a strong preference for long term orientation, especially given that I also have a strong preference for conscientiousness amongst the big 5 personality traits. So, okay, let's go to the last dimension, which is indulgence. So, cultures can be either high on indulgence or low on indulgence. And what indulgence means is that the degree to which people in the society allow the immediate gratification of desires pertaining to leisure, pertaining to enjoyment, pertaining to relaxation. So I personally see, quite a bit of overlap between the indulgence dimension and long-term, short-term orientation dimension. Although Hofstede would argue they are independent dimensions, and in some ways they are, right? The time factor does play more predominant role in the long-term, short-term orientation. And in the indulgence dimension, the focus is more on the pleasure part, right? In other words, you can have a long-term orientation and be indulgent, be high on indulgence. In other words, you can plan for leisure into the future so that you can have a really fun, relaxed retirement plan, for instance. So yes, in some on some aspects, these 2 dimensions can be orthogonal. They can be different, distinct dimensions. But then there are certain overlaps too, because if you are high on indulgence, we tend to describe those people typically as you succumb to immediate gratification. And most of the immediate gratification issues tend to happen with respect to pleasure. And as a society, of course, you would agree that world over, we are going more in the direction of high indulgence because we are prioritizing pleasure. Even in our day to day decisions, actions, we often gravitate towards social media and many of the other tools just so that we get our dopamine hit. So, worldwide, I think as a society, we are going more in this direction. That does not mean that there are not countries with low indulgence approach. But in fact, you would see that even amongst some people within United States, some people do not necessarily enjoy or like to indulge themselves with lot of pleasure, luxury. They would rather prefer a Spartan kind of lifestyle. In fact, the term Spartan has the international culture component that comes into play because the Spartan warriors, they were very disciplined. They did not necessarily try to seek pleasure as much. They prioritized discipline and hard work and self-restraint more. And that is something that in fact you also see low indulgence. This is something that you also see amongst, should I say, the Stoic philosophers. And that is also a philosophy that I subscribe to. Does not mean that I do not enjoy life, does not mean that I do not prioritize or work-life balance. But the point is that I try to make an effort not to fall into the trap of high intelligence because it can be what is called the hedonistic treadmill. Like on a treadmill, you are not going anywhere, you are on the same spot. So when you are overindulging, you don't necessarily get more happy. Rather, there is a decline in happiness. And you can understand even with simple examples like somebody eating one small ice cream versus one full tub of ice cream. You don't actually become happier eating the full tub of ice cream or watching 8 episodes of some series. Rather, your happiness declines. You rather become more unhappy. So just seeking more indulgence does not automatically mean that you live happier and relaxed, more enjoyable life. These are some dimensions that, aspects that come to mind. But the overall point that I wanted to make is that as leaders, then you have to take all these factors into consideration when you are dealing with people from different cultures or when you are going and working in an environment which has a culture different from what you may be accustomed to. I did give you examples of long-term, short-term implications for leaders, but even for indulgence, you can see it can have some significant implications for leaders, right? If you are in a high indulgence culture, that's where you are a leader, you would have to, for instance, prioritize employees' work-life balance more. You may have to allow them to engage in more leisure activities. You may have to give them, by the way, when I'm saying have to, I'm not saying in the sense that you are having some compulsion, you are forced to do that, but you will be more effective if you follow those approaches. You are likely to see greater employee morale, productivity when you employ those approaches. Whereas in the low indulgence culture, as a leader, you could foster more of a work environment that values dedication, that values perseverance, that values working beyond what one has signed up for. By the way, I'm not, again, advocating that all employees should be taking this approach. No, because there are limits to everything. Ultimately, a balanced approach works best. But these are some of the things that you would need to take into consideration as a leader. So that's in broad the different Hofstede dimensions and the implications they have for leaders. But I will be asking you more about what practical implications do you anticipate incorporating into your approach of leadership. And of course, then you will submit those insights in your discussion and assignments. But we will stop it here. Thank you.